the Reverend Matt Dunch, SJ. He's doing a DPhil in the Theology and Religion faculty at Oxford, exploring spiritual pedagogy. He's got a Master of Arts degree in philosophy from Loyola University, Chicago, where he explored challenges to empathetic understanding posed by radically divergent bodily conditions of interlocutors, particularly those caused by disability. He earned a Master's of Divinity and a Master of Theology degrees, as well as their ecclesiastical analogues, the Bachelor of Theology and License of Theology at Regis College at the University of Toronto. His theological work focused on the relationship of mysticism to ethics. He taught philosophy for 3 years at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. His teaching included courses on ethics, epistemology, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of religion. He's also developed service learning ethics courses centered on homelessness and outsider art. So I'm sure he won't mind me saying this, but Matt is a philosopher in the analytic tradition with extraordinary clarity of mind, I think, and the ability to put forward arguments in a robust but non-aggressive way, with interest in phenomenology and in the concerns of our conference. So today, the title of his lecture is John Zizioulas and Emmanuel Levinas on Totality, Otherness, and the possibility of communion. So over to you, Matt.
Well, thank you, Kevin, for that gracious introduction. And it's certainly worth getting up for, even though it is very early here in the Midwestern United States. So in this paper, I want to explore the relationship between religious context and fundamental categories, looking at Emmanuel Levinas and John Zizioulas. Now, I imagine some of Levinas is probably well known to folks. John Zizioulas maybe less so. John Zizioulas is an Orthodox theologian and bishop, and his theological project has a lot of creative and ongoing dialogue with contemporary philosophy. He's probably maybe the most important Orthodox Christian theologian writing today, and probably nowadays he's most well known for ecological ethics and the Orthodox response to that, but he's also written a lot on being and communion. So among Zizulas's many influences is the French phenomenologist Emmanuel Levinas. And I want to look at the powerful and conflicting role of pre-philosophical vertical experience in both these thinkers. They don't suggest the collapse of philosophy into pre-philosophy, but a sometimes porous border between philosophy and religious experience, or even between philosophy and theology. The theme that various speakers in the conference have already addressed variously and eloquently. To take just one example from a rich array of papers, I think the dialogue between Zizulas and Levinas might be partly understood as conflicting articulations of the self-founding phenomena of conversion that Professor Hart talked about. Certainly in Zizulas's case, the Eucharist is a positive reduction, as Hart articulates it, though in Levinas something possibly more negative. In any event, phenomenology is colored by the pre-philosophical, and this helps to articulate rather than arbitrate divisions across religious divides. My modest contribution this morning is to offer a case study of this porous border between Zizulas and Levinas. Now, both figures are truth-seeking religionists striving for a philosophical account of persons and relationships that is resonant, whether explicitly or implicitly, with their own pre-philosophical religious experience and community. Now, for some, the relationship between these two important figures is of inherent interest, but I think of wider interest, especially for the purposes of this conference, is the interplay between how phenomenology analyzes religion and how pre-philosophical verticality shapes philosophical analysis. In the case of Levinas and Zizulas, this uncertain relationship is most clearly manifest in their mutual resistance to ontological totality and divergence on the possibility of communion with the other, which is impossible for Levinas and the central phenomenon of life for Zizulas. Zizulas finds Levinas helpful in articulating the relationship between personhood and otherness, but ultimately problematic in understanding persons in communion. Picking up on a theme from Professor Steinbach's paper, both are negotiating relationality, albeit differently conceived. Now, Levinas's philosophical utility for Zizulas and the difficulties which he poses both arise in part from the deep influence of Levinas's Judaism on his philosophical work. By contrast, Zizulas' philosophical speculations on personhood are guided by his theological commitments and experience as an Orthodox Christian, particularly the experience of Eucharistic communion. While a rich debate between the two figures may be conducted strictly on the level of metaphysics and their resistance to totalizing ontology, I think richer lessons may be gleaned by grounding their metaphysical dispute in the theological stances and religious experience, in their theological expanses and religious experience, in other words, context. Though distinct, the philosophical and theological are mutually interpenetrating. Their respective religious experiences shape what each takes to be the central phenomenon or grounding experience of their thought, communion, and otherness. Zizulas and Levinas's encounter underlines the vital role of Eucharist in understanding personhood, communion, and otherness for Orthodox Christians, and the demands of the law towards others for Jews. In both cases, philosophy and theology demand a profound response, though they differ strikingly on the quality of that response, a relationship of ethical demand towards the other, or one of communion with that other. The tension and consonance between Levinas and Zizulas seems to vindicate Levinas's claim that, and I quote, all philosophical thought rests on pre-philosophical experience, end quote. Levinas made this claim in the context of discussing the role of the Bible as a largely unconscious foundation to his own philosophical work. The interrelation of philosophy, pre-philosophical experience, and theology is not to despair of philosophy, but is both to question its pristine neutrality and to call attention to the pre-philosophical influences latent in philosophical debate and even higher order theory. Though Zizulas never articulates it, I think the resonance of the Bible, the law, and Jewish life in Levinas's phenomenology is both an attraction and a tension for Zizulas. For Levinas, ethics is first philosophy. Ethics, that is the encounter with the other, goes beyond and gives meaning to the everyday, the totalized. Ethics is in the phenomenon of the face of the other. Levinas claims ethics is optics. One cannot see aright, cannot clearly reflect phenomenologically, except when under the demands of the other. Ethics, beyond being and power, resonates deeply with the primacy of ethical demands of the Mosaic law promulgated by a mysterious, infinite, and thoroughly other God. Importantly, ethics as first philosophy is both the basis of Levinas's phenomenology and represents his way of reading the Talmud, a point I'll return to later. Ethics as first philosophy, as a phenomenological claim, may be defensible without reference to scripture, but the resonance with the infinite other, proclaiming absolute ethical norms atop a mountain in the Sinai desert, cannot easily be ignored. In a discussion of the Christian tradition of God's ontological otherness in Being as Communion, his celebrated early work, John Zizioulas writes, it is the question of knowing whether otherness can make sense in ontology, whether ontology can do anything more than rest on the idea of totality. To a large extent, this is still an open question, end quote. Zizulas' hope is that ontology can be freed from totality. Ontological totality excludes the freedom necessary for true personhood and is antithetical to the understanding of person as openness or ecstasis of being beyond worldly constraints and oriented towards an infinite God. Zizulas finds this understanding of personhood in the early Christian tradition, particularly in the Cappadocians. His goal is to articulate a being in communion which both preserves the freedom of the individual beings and through this freedom allows for a profound relationship between beings, a profound communion between beings. Zizulas is searching for an ontology that better captures this understanding of personhood. In a footnote to this discussion of ontology and being as communion, Zizulas writes intriguingly, here Christian theology can benefit considerably from E. Levinas's remarkable work, Totality and Infinity, end quote. Zizulas hopes that Levinas will help theologians find a philosophical way beyond the constraints of totality. In Communion and Otherness, Zizulas' later large book, he explores the themes of personhood, otherness, communion, and following his own suggestion, engages in an extended analysis of Levinas's work on otherness and personhood. Now, Levinas seldom uses the term person or personhood, though this is a semantic rather than substantial difference. And Zizulas is right to see in Levinas an interlocutor about personhood. Zizulas writes, with Levinas, we come closer to the patristic understanding of otherness than with any of the philosophers mentioned above, namely Buber, Heidegger, Hegel, Husserl, and the Greek philosophers in general. For Levinas, the other is not constituted by the self, as Husserl, etc. would, nor by relationality as such, as Buber would, but rather an absolute alterity, which cannot be derived, engendered, or constituted on the basis of anything other than itself, end quote. While most other modern philosophers ground the other in some aspect of totality, such as self or relation, Levinas grounds the other in nothing but otherness. Levinas offers a philosophical means of moving beyond totalizing ontology so that God and the human person can be understood in their otherness and freedom, which transforms and properly establishes the I in the encounter. Levinas writes, the identity of the same in the ego comes to it despite itself from outside, as an election or an inspiration, in the form of the uniqueness of someone assigned, unquote. Ontology, the individual essences of things and their interrelation in this context, is subordinate to a metaphysics of encounter with the other. Zizulas ultimately finds Levinas's understanding of other persons, both human and divine, fruitful but wanting. While helpful in articulating the otherness of persons, Levinas argues for the impossibility of communion between persons, contending that such communion would inevitably constitute a return to totality. Otherness requires separation, which, for Levinas, is antithetical to communion, as Zizulas would like to have it. In lieu of communion, Levinas uses ethics to ground interrelation between persons. Throughout his theological corpus, Zizulas argues that communion is essential for being and personhood. Quote, there is no true being without communion. Nothing can exist as an individual conceivable in itself, unquote. Zizulas is equally careful to preserve the individual. Quote, the person cannot exist without communion, but every form of communion which denies or suppresses the person is inadmissible, end of quote. Zizulas argues that this holding of otherness and communion is present in the early church and in the conciliar declarations. He writes, quote, if Chalcedonian Christology were to be expressed philosophically, it would be absolutely necessary to work out an ontology whereby distance is not an inevitable corollary to otherness. That's very important for him, that distance is not the inevitable corollary to otherness. And unity does not destroy, but, and this is important, affirms and realizes otherness, unquote. Unlike Levinas, the pre-philosophical demands on philosophy are explicit in the Zizulas, namely coherence with and help exploring this doctrinal tradition of otherness with communion, of otherness affirming a kind of communion. His use of these sources is subtler, though, these doctrinal sources is subtler than mere doctrinal tests, a more creative appropriation of various philosophies and of his own tradition. Now, Zizulas explores many philosophical tools to express personhood, the Platonic loss of self in the universal, and various modern idealist reincarnations of the priority of the universal are rejected, as are the concrete but impermanent persons of the Aristotelian tradition as he sees them. Zizulas finds some promise in existentialist and phenomenological traditions with their emphasis on selfhood and freedom. He engages with figures such as Heidegger, Husserl, and Sartre, though their defense of the free self is helpful. Quote, the ontological priority of self over the other, unquote, is problematic for Zizulas. The phenomenological tradition is promising in that it attempts to overcome Cartesian individualism. It provides structures for the encounter between self and other. In this vein, Zizulas notes especially Heidegger's Mitsein, being with. However, with Heidegger and most other phenomenologists, self and the world are ontologically prior to the other. Dasein, the being of the self in Heidegger's terms, is prior to Mitsein. Levinas and Zizulas find both find this reduction of the other to the same unacceptable, as it would deprive the other of freedom. Levinas relies on the thought of Heidegger and the existentialist and phenomenological schools more broadly, as does Zizulas. However, he profoundly shifts the priority from self to other, while retaining the rich understanding of the self that characterizes existentialist and phenomenological philosophy. Levinas seeks to bracket ontology, which is the totalized world of universals and sameness, or the totalitarianism of being, as Zizulas would put it. Put simply, the other cannot be placed into pre-established ontological categories. The other must constitute categories. For Levinas, metaphysics is a stand beyond the pre-established categories of ontology. Such a moving beyond is not a stance of methodological neutrality, but a response to an ethical demand. Refusing to place the other into an ontological category also frees the self, as Levinas writes. The relation between the same and the other metaphysics is primordially enacted as conversation, where the same, gathered up in its ipseity as an I, as a particular existent, unique, and autochthonous, leaves itself, unquote. In order to be a self, one must move beyond the self as sameness and be open to the other outside of ontological categories. Levinas argues that the I is constantly made and reconstituted in this encounter with the other. Quote, the I is not being that always remains the same, but is the being whose existing consists in identifying itself, in recovering its identity throughout all that happens to it, unquote. Just as I am constituted by encounter with the other, so too all persons, all I's are constituted by encounter with the others. I move out of a desire for the other, which forms the identity of the self. The self needs the other in order to be a person, but the other does not need the self to constitute it. Now, vital for the dialogue between Levinas and Zizulas is precisely how ontology constrains freedom and whether ontology may coexist with freedom. This is the nub of the dispute. For Levinas, ontology is an intolerable constraint on both human persons and God. If ontology is an intolerable constraint for the human other, this is all the more true of the divine other. Levinas cautions that, quote, theology imprudently treats the idea of the relationship between God and the creature in terms of ontology, unquote. Religion exists outside the realm of totalizing ontology. Levinas writes, quote, we propose to call religion the bond that is established between the same, which includes the self, and the other without constituting a totality, unquote. Levinas's distinction here resonates with Zizulas's patristic argument for God's action in the world. Following Maximus the Confessor, Zizulas argues that God approaches the world, quote, through a person, unquote. While not excluding ontology as thoroughly as Levinas does, Zizulas heavily qualifies ontology by arguing that God approaches world through an ontology of how rather than what, or tropos rather than logos. Though in Levinas' sense, this is not an ontology at all, but probably more clearly a metaphysics. Zizulas argues that this distinction allows Maximus to avoid quote, totalitarianism or monistic ontology so deeply feared by Levinas, unquote. So Zizulas is trying to use Maximus as a way of responding to Levinas, interestingly. Zizulas also notes that this distinction arises from Christology and Trinitarian theology, that which is pre-philosophical. Now, as a Jew, Levinas would not accept these sorts of theological motivations for the distinction, though minimally it is part of the pre-philosophical for Zizulas that Levinas defends in his own work, but also the most fundamental foundation of Zizulas's thinking and Christological experience. So we have a pre-philosophical foundation in Zizulas that is consonant with Levinas's work, though Levinas certainly would not accept the pre-philosophical foundation Zizulas is using to agree with Levinas. Zizulas argues that Maximus's distinction allows for ontology with freedom, albeit a non-standard type of ontology, whereas Levinas cuts ontological links between other and self, though the other constitutes the self in a unilateral relation. Levinas heavily qualifies the ontological relationship between other and self, both between God and human persons, and between God and persons and human persons between themselves. Now, Zizulas provocatively questions, quote, the eschatology of otherness in Levinas, unquote, and in so doing illustrates the main difference between Levinas and himself. Quote, we are confronted with a fundamental difference from the Greek fathers, for whom God, the other par excellence, as Eros moves outside himself and attracts as the ultimate distinction of their desire, those whose desire he provokes, unquote. For Levinas, the eschaton is in the transcendent ethical demands of the other, such that moving beyond ontology does not imply an ultimate destination, a vision of the beatific vision, but a continual process. The other is ultimately out of reach for Levinas. Communion with the other is impossible, and the attempt is merely to collapse back into sameness. Ethical demand remains and are never ultimately satisfied, but continue to provide purpose and direction in human existence. Though Zizulas does not offer an extended treatment of why he differs with Levinas on communion, he briefly explains, quote, postmodernism would suspect that a coincidence of otherness with communion as leading to some sort of totalizing reduction bordering on violence. It is suspicion and fear of this kind that led Levinas and others to reject relational otherness, unquote. Yet Zizulas's ascription of to Levinas's position of suspicion and fear seems at best superficial. Levinas's thought, by his own admission, is deeply influenced by his Jewish faith. As quoted above, Levinas notes that, quote, all philosophical thought rests on pre-philosophical experience, and that the readings of the Bible belonged, in my, Levinas's case, to these fundamental experiences. The Bible has therefore played an essential role in my philosophical thought, for the most part, however, without my being conscious of it, unquote. Levinas's philosophy flows from his Judaism and the ethical demands of the law originating in a command of God, who is wholly other and known only as a unity. Though, as I said, Zizulas does not discuss Levinas as a Jewish thinker, one reason Levinas is able to articulate otherness so persuasively and usefully for Zizulas is the Jewish understanding of the otherness of God, which is a model for Levinas. Zizulas and Levinas find common ground on otherness to the extent that Jews and Christians both affirm the otherness of God from creation. From this divine model of otherness comes a model for human otherness. In one of his commentaries on the Talmud, which, though not a philosophical text per se, echoes themes in his philosophy, Levinas writes, quote, all that is said of God in Judaism signifies through human praxis, God appears to human consciousness, and especially in human experience, clothed in value. And this clothing is not foreign to his nature or to his supernature. The ideal, the rational, the universal, the eternal, the very high, the transsubjective, etc., notions accessible to the intellect are his moral clothing. Religious experience, at least for the Talmud, can only be primarily a moral experience. I think that last point is particularly important. Religious experience, at least for the Talmud, can only be primarily a moral experience, end quote. The divine other comes to the self through a moral experience of the human other. If one takes Levinas at his word that religious experience is moral experience, his objection to communion looks neither fearful nor suspicious. Levinas, as a Jewish thinker, formulates a fundamental phenomenon that aligns with his understanding of traditional Jewish thought. As noted above, for Levinas, ethics is first philosophy. Not only is ethics optics, but further, quote, ethics is an optics of the divine. No relation to God is more right or more immediate. The divine cannot manifest itself except through the neighbor. The neighbor who is the other, quote, end quote. The neighbor who is the other remains forever at a distance. Levinas argues that one can be close to her neighbors, but that the neighbor as other always demands something and is never fully known to one. In the midst of this striving to help the neighbor, one finds for Levinas, quote, God arises as the counterpart to justice rendered to the other person, unquote. God is not active in the Talmud, but having given the law, God has left people with responsibility. The Talmud exhorts, quote, all Jews are responsible one for the other, unquote. For Levinas, the fulfillment of the law is encounter with the divine. Levinas distrusts any encounter with the divine that does not go through the human. Levinas writes, God is real and concrete, not through incarnation, but through law, unquote. Levinas argues that once the law is given, no further divine intervention is necessary. If God is manifest through law, the ontological distinction Zizulas borrows from St. Maximus of how versus what is superfluous, in that one does not need a reciprocal relationship with the law. The how-what distinction is premised on personal reciprocal relations. Relationship with the law can be unidirectional. The law, like the other, can impose itself on the self without the self imposing on the law. In a late essay, written partly in response to Derrida's critique of Levinas, arguing that Levinas does not go far enough in breaking away from the totality of Western philosophy, and that language traps one in totalizing ontology, Levinas uses the category of the other and the same, that Levinas, who uses categories such as other and same and even the word God, is already thematizing according to the critique of Derrida, or alternatively, that language about transcendence and God may be nonsense or unintelligible. If one cannot escape thematization on the one hand and nonsense on the other, one cannot go beyond as Levinas proposes, nor can one speak of being in communion as Zizulas would have it. Levinas attempts to respond to Derrida and this opposition between transcendence and system by investigating the essence of knowing what is found in consciousness. Both the facts of ontology and those things beyond being are about which we arise in consciousness. Understanding the relationship between the two, between consciousness and what arises beyond, and the non-triviality of what is beyond requires investigating consciousness. Levinas postulates a state he calls insomnia. Insomnia is a way of being without focus or objects. Jeffrey Bleukel helpfully summarizes the insomniac thus, quote, the insomniac is reduced to naked vigilance, to a gaze that is helplessly exposed before a night without stable shape or texture, end quote. Insomnia is the most naked consciousness. Insomnia, neither sleep nor alertness, but a sort of twilight watchfulness. As Levinas says, insomnia is a wakefulness, but a wakefulness without intentionality, disinterested, end quote. Insomnia does not have the limit of objects. In the emptiness of insomnia is a kind of limitlessness. Quote, it is uncontained infinity, unquote. Levinas ties insomnia to the awareness of what is beyond totality, quote. And in Transcendence and Intelligibility, he writes, quote, theology already announces itself in the very wakefulness of insomnia. In the vigil, the troubled vigilance of the psyche before the moment when the finitude of being, wounded by the infinite, is prompted to gather itself into the hegemonic and atheist ego of knowledge, end quote. In insomnia, the human being is opened, ready to be awakened and thematizing. Phenomenology may recognize insomnia, but has no power to thematize it. It's that raw encounter with infinite otherness. Zizulas, unlike Levinas in his insomnia, needs philosophical tools to accommodate a God who is real, concrete, cher, as we heard from folk, through incarnation, to accommodate the implications of personhood and freedom which flows from this. Zizulas writes that early Christian theologians who influenced his work made philosophical progress as the result of their experience of the Eucharist and of the Church, this positive founding phenomenon, articulating the ontology of communion, quote, which would never have been possible without the experience of ecclesial being, and without ecclesiology would lose its deep meaning, end quote. The prerequisite for patristic theologians, philosophical revolution in the understanding of the self, were the demands of the experience of the Eucharist, a positive experience. For both Zizulas and Levinas, the experience of mystery is prior to that articulation of mystery, though they're articulating what they take to be different mysteries. Zizulas expands on his point elsewhere, arguing, it must be strongly underlined, quote, it must be strongly underlined that without this foundation of the Church's Eucharistic experience, the Trinitarian theology of the 4th century, which is what grounds Zizulas' theory of personhood, would remain a problem, end quote. The Eucharistic liturgy of the Church is the event of communion and both the origin of and final criterion for philosophical speculation on the relationship between communion and otherness for Zizulas. Now, Zizulas' account of fallen humanity shows some similarities with Levinas' resistance to communion. For Zizulas, the fall is a rupture between being and communion, quote, communion is no longer constitutive of being in a fallen state, end quote. For Zizulas, baptism and especially Eucharist are a reconstitution of communion with God. Quote, Eucharist is the heart of the Church where communion and otherness are realized par excellence. It is in the Eucharist that the Orthodox Christian experiences not only the law of God, but the logos of God incarnate and the love of God of the Trinity. The distinction Zizulas borrows from Maximus regarding how ontology, which Levinas implicitly rejects, finds its true meaning not as an abstract piece of metaphysical speculation, but in this Eucharistic context. Zizulas writes, there is no theosis outside the Eucharist, for it is there that communion and otherness coincide and reach their fullness, end quote. Levinas, in his rejection of communion, would likewise reject this sort of theosis. For Zizulas, through the Eucharist, communion maintains otherness. The experience of communion and otherness is prior to theorization. And now, as an aside, Professor Falk spoke of the real body of the Eucharist in his lecture and made a point of contrasting this with Levinas' understanding of the body. I think this is another manifestation of the pre-philosophical manifest through two different understandings of phenomenology. Two pre-philosophical experiences work their way into that phenomenological articulation. Zizulas emphasizes the importance of the Eucharistic community not only on the metaphysical level, but personally. In more phenomenological terms, the reduction of the Eucharist reveals the central phenomenon to Christians individually and the Christian community. The Eucharistic assembly shows the Church's communion with one another and with God. Orthodox Christians have an experience of communion, a taste of heaven on earth. That experience is not limited to participation of the in the assembly on Sunday, but is also an eschatology. The end of time and the fullness of communion gives the Eucharist its character. Quote, the Eucharist is not a sacrament, but a manifestation of eschatological community in its totality. It is at, quote, end quote, it is out of this breadth and depth of Eucharistic communion that Zizulas articulates the need for an adequate ontology of communion and otherness. On a strictly philosophical level, the dialogue between Zizulas and Levinas is interesting as both present original philosophical insights. However, both figures are motivated by extra-philosophical concerns, but also theological concerns and a way of being that informs phenomenology. Both write out of a profound awe at an infinite God who resists the thematization of totality. The way both thinkers understand personhood is contingent on coming to be fully awake, coming to a religious and phenomenological conversion within their respective communities and practices, however. For Levinas, deeply immersed in Jewish culture and religion, the law needs no communion, only otherness. To serve the other because she is a friend is to slip back into totality. For Zizulas, the Eucharistic experience of otherness and communion opens new horizons to theological discovery and demands an ongoing search for better philosophical tools to express the ontological possibility of persons who are both in communion and other. Thank you.